Hey, what's up everybody? Monday, September 30th. Today is the last day of September. It's the last day of the quarter. It is the last day of the fiscal year. And if you want to talk about something special, $5 trillion. More than $5 trillion. Let me throw that number out there. Wrap your head around that. That is so far the total amount of U.S. federal government spending this fiscal year, and we still have another statement day. It's going to be over $5 trillion. That is unprecedented. $5 trillion of spending. Folks, if you go back to prior to 2009, the great financial crash, the government spent about 2.5 trillion annually. After the great financial crash in 2009, that number jumped up to over 4 trillion. As a matter of fact, in 2009, it hit 4.5 trillion. That was an enormous increase. Of course, that was almost a doubling. I mean, if you want to think about how or why the economy turned on a dime when we were in the worst financial crash and economic recession since the Great Depression, literally turned on a dime and everything started to go back up, was that near doubling in government spending. I mean, if you think about it right now, 5 trillion is a huge number and it is a record, but last year the number was about 4.8 trillion, 4.7 trillion. Okay, now if you think about a doubling, imagine if the government spent not 5 trillion, but 9.6 trillion or 10 trillion. That would be like the equivalent of what happened in 2009 compared to 2008. So we were going into the black hole. Maybe we were going into another depression, not just a recession, but that massive amount of government spending literally turned everything on a dime, lifted up the entire economy, and we've been rolling on that. Notice that ever since 2009, we have never fallen below 4 trillion. Last year, like I said, we had about 4.7 trillion. This year, 5 trillion. So that's what's holding the economy up. And that's happening despite some really, really bad policy. Like if you want to talk about the trade war and the tariffs, if you want to talk about the deflationary monetary policy of the Fed and other central banks all over the world, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, the RBA, the RBNZ, the Bank of Canada, I mean, you name it. They're all, again, embarking on this very negative and contractionary monetary policy, which is not just a headwind, but a major, major impediment to economic growth. But it's literally been, the heavy lifting, if I could use that phrase, is really being done by U.S. fiscal, by the U.S. government with this 5 trillion of spending. But just go back and think, or think about if that number, rather than 5 trillion, if it was 10 trillion, man, I mean, we'd be growing at, who knows, 10% GDP. Inflation would be surging. I mean, it would be really, really incredible. And that's what happened in the transition from 2008 to 2009. But anyway, 5 trillion is really impressive. And the core of that spending, as I've explained many times, there's really 4 things that support more than half of all that spending. One, of course, is Social Security. That alone is over 900 billion, close to $1 trillion, that alone, and that is expanding every year. I don't know what the exact number is, but it's something like 50,000 people a day qualify for Social Security. So the Social Security recipient, the roles of recipients are expanding day in and day out, and that's going to continue for a long time because the baby boomer generation is just now starting to reach retirement age and they're becoming eligible for Social Security benefits. The next thing is Medicare. Medicare is about 800 billion, okay? The next thing is Medicaid, which is just under 500 billion. Those 3 things combined, all right, are close to 2 trillion, or I should say over 2 trillion. And then you have defense, which is a discretionary spending item, not like the other three things which are non-discretionary, but defense is pretty much treated like a non-discretionary spending item, at least under Trump, and we have seen an enormous increase in the Trump presidency so far. So those four things, defense spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all combined, and they're all growing, account for more than half of all government spending. It is enormous and very powerful support to the economy. It's going to probably remain that way. When I say probably, the only thing up for question really is defense, but you never know. They might try to cut Social Security. I mean, if those things are ever cut significantly, then that's it. We are in recession, long-term, very high unemployment, but I don't suspect, at least not the three so-called entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, because that's they're often called the third rail of American politics. So that's been going on. So yeah, the number, we're ending the fiscal year now at over 5 trillion. That is a new all-time record. Now folks, as I mentioned here, despite the negative policies, monetary policy of the Fed and other central banks, which is really a very, very significant headwind to economic growth, the longer term trends are going to be dictated by these fiscal flows, these leading flows as I like to call them, and they are going to be expanding. Now, it's maddening, it's frustrating. For example, if you are an investor in risk assets like stocks, like commodities, oil for example, you got to stay long these markets. And it's hard sometimes. I understand that. It's very hard because it doesn't feel like it wants to go up. It always feels like it wants to go down. And you have to understand that it is primarily the result of negative or detrimental monetary policy, creating those headwinds that push back on these big macro trends. But underlying that, these fiscal flows, the leading flows, as I just mentioned, over time, those will lift these markets and continue to push them to new highs or highs in the case of some of these commodities. Every time you get pullbacks, you have to buy these things. Now, I talk about this in my latest issue of MMT Trader, which came out today. Remember, I'm the only guy out there who has an applied approach to MMT. A lot of academics out there, a lot of people talking theory and MMT concepts. As a matter of fact, one MMT conference just ended, and I can guarantee you, I can bet you 1,000% that nobody who was a speaker or presenter at that conference talked about an applied approach to MMT. It was all theory, it was all concepts, probably a lot of mainstream economics thrown in there as well, because that's sort of the class of people that they invite to speak, outside of the handful of MMT people there. Politics, maybe some legal stuff. I'm the only guy that does applied MMT. So you can get my report, MMT Trader. Go to my website, pitbulleconomics.com. Sign up for a 30-day free trial. 5 trillion, folks. That is a big number. That is a big, big number. And really, all you have to do is look at these budget agreements each year and see what they decide on spending levels. And it even goes beyond that, like I said, because the main ones in there, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and also defense, all non-discretionary. Well, not defense, but that's the way it's treated. And they just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's how come since 2009, we have never been in a recession. And all these economists are scratching their heads saying, well, why, we can't understand this. This is the longest non-recessionary cycle we have ever seen. Yeah, because they're not even paying attention to this stuff, which continues to expand. It's going to continue to hold the market up, despite all the terrible policy that we see coming out of central banks, not just here from the Fed, but everywhere, really. So it's the fiscal, folks. Sorry, it's the fiscal. That's what it is. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.